The streets of Washington, D.C. were unusually quiet that autumn evening in 1967. The sun had already dipped below the horizon, leaving behind a purple-orange glow that painted the sky in soft strokes. Most government workers had long since headed home, but one car still made its way through the city's winding streets. Inside the modest black sedan, Attorney General Clark loosened his tie after what had been an exhausting day at the Justice Department. The stack of files on his passenger seat reminded him of the civil rights cases that had kept him working well past dinner time. His wife would understand, she always did, but his stomach growled in protest of the missed meal. The streetlights flickered to life one by one as he drove, casting long shadows across the empty sidewalks. His mind wandered to the morning's meeting about voter registration in the South, and he barely noticed when he rolled through a stop sign at a quiet intersection. The flash of red and blue lights in his rearview mirror quickly snapped him back to reality. Clark pulled over smoothly, reaching for his wallet while watching the police cruiser park behind him. Through his side mirror, he could see the officer step out, a tall figure moving with purpose, hand resting casually on his belt. There was something about the officer's stance that made Clark uneasy, a tension in his movements that seemed out of place for a routine traffic stop. The beam of a flashlight suddenly cut through his rear window, so bright it made him squint. The officer's footsteps were heavy, deliberate as they approached. Clark rolled down his window, ready to explain himself, but before he could speak, the flashlight beam hit him directly in the face. "License and registration," the officer barked, his voice carrying an edge that seemed unnecessary for the situation. "And keep your hands where I can see them." "Of course, officer," Clark replied calmly, trying to blink away the spots dancing in his vision from the bright light. "I apologize for missing that stop sign. I'm afraid I was lost in thought about work." "Yeah? What kind of work has you breaking traffic laws?" The officer's tone was mocking, almost eager for confrontation. The name on his badge caught the flashlight's glare, Officer Davidson. "I'm actually the Attorney General," Clark said, keeping his voice steady and professional. "My identification is in my glove compartment. May I reach for it?" A harsh laugh cut through the night air. "Right, and I'm the President of the United States. You think I haven't heard every excuse in the book?" Davidson's flashlight beam never wavered, keeping Clark partially blinded. "Another guy who thinks he's too important to follow the rules, huh?" The situation was quickly spinning away from a simple traffic stop into something more concerning. Clark could feel the tension building in the air like static before a storm. His years of legal experience told him to stay calm, to handle this by the book, but something in Davidson's demeanor suggested this night was about to become far more complicated than he'd anticipated. Through the glare of the flashlight, Clark caught glimpses of other cars slowing down as they passed, their drivers rubbernecking at the scene unfolding on the side of the road. He realized that what happened next would matter not just for him, but for everyone who'd ever found themselves in a similar situation with far less power to protect themselves. The night air grew colder, and somewhere in the distance, a siren wailed. Neither man moved, locked in a moment that balanced on a knife's edge. Clark's hand remained frozen halfway to his glove compartment, while Officer Davidson's fingers twitched near his holster. The simple act of reaching for his identification was about to set in motion a chain of events that would change both their lives forever. Little did either man know that this seemingly routine traffic stop would soon become a story shared in police academies and law schools across the country. A testament to how quickly authority could be misused, and how the response to that misuse could reshape the very nature of justice in their city. The tension in the air thickened as Officer Davidson's command rang out through the night. "Step out of the vehicle, now." His hand had moved from resting on his belt to gripping his holster, a movement that made Clark's heart skip a beat. Keeping his movements slow and deliberate, Clark opened his car door. The autumn wind whipped around them, carrying fallen leaves across the pavement. Somewhere in the distance, a dog barked, the sound echoing through the otherwise silent street. "Hands where I can see them," Davidson ordered, his voice carrying a mix of authority and something else, perhaps fear, or maybe just the intoxication of power. Clark raised his hands carefully, the sleeves of his expensive suit catching the harsh beam of the flashlight. "Officer, I understand your caution, but there's been a misunderstanding." Clark tried again, his voice steady despite the growing anxiety in his chest. "If you'll just allow me to show you my credentials." "Oh, you're still playing that game?" Davidson cut him off with a bitter laugh. "The 'do you know who I am' routine. Let me tell you something. Out here on these streets, everyone's the same. No special treatment." More cars were slowing down now, their headlights illuminating the scene like spotlights on a stage. Clark could see faces pressed against windows, witnesses to what was quickly becoming a public spectacle. The irony wasn't lost on him. Just hours ago, he'd been reviewing cases of police misconduct, and now here he was, living through it. Davidson circled him like a predator, flashlight beam never wavering. "Spread your legs." Hands on the hood. The command came sharp and fast. Clark complied, the cold metal of his car seeping through his palms. He could feel the eyes of passers-by burning into his back, the whispers and stares of people who'd never expect to see a man in an expensive suit being treated like a common criminal. "You know," Davidson continued, his voice dripping with sarcasm as he began the pat-down, "we get all types trying to talk their way out of tickets. But Attorney General? That's a new one." His hands were rough, deliberately so, as they moved across Clark's clothes. "What's next? Gonna tell me you have dinner plans with the president?" The humiliation burned hot on Clark's face, but something else was building inside him too, not anger, but determination. Every second of this encounter was cementing his resolve to address the systemic issues that allowed such abuse of power to occur. A second set of headlights appeared, different from the passing cars. The familiar red and blue lights of another police cruiser approached, slowing to a stop behind Davidson's vehicle. Clark could hear the crunch of gravel under tires, the sound of a car door opening and closing. "Everything all right here, Davidson?" A new voice cut through the tension, older, more seasoned. Footsteps approached, and Clark could see Davidson's posture change slightly, becoming more defensive. "Just dealing with another wise guy, Sergeant," Davidson replied, his tone slightly less confident now. "Claims he's the Attorney General, if you can believe that." The beam of a new flashlight joined Davidson's, but this one moved to illuminate Clark's face properly. There was a moment of heavy silence, broken only by a sharp intake of breath from the sergeant. "Oh my God," the sergeant's voice was barely above a whisper. "Davidson, you idiot, that is Attorney General Clark." The night seemed to freeze. Davidson's flashlight beam wavered for the first time, then dropped entirely. The weight of realization crashed down like a physical force, and Clark could almost hear the officer's world shifting on its axis. Everything that happened in the next few moments would be crucial, not just for these men, but for the larger story of justice and accountability in their city. As Clark straightened his suit jacket, he was already thinking about how to turn this moment of humiliation into something meaningful, something that could create real change. The passing cars had started to slow down even more now, their occupants sensing that they were witnessing something significant. The night air carried whispers and the occasional flash of a camera, documenting a moment that would soon become much bigger than any of them could imagine. The world seemed to shrink to a single point as Officer Davidson's hand moved to his gun. The metallic sound of the weapon leaving its holster cut through the night air like a knife, sending a chill down Clark's spine. Time slowed to a crawl as the barrel of the gun caught the gleam of nearby streetlights. "I said freeze." Davidson's voice cracked slightly, betraying his own nervousness as Clark's hand hovered near the glove compartment. The Attorney General's fingers were just inches from his identification, the very thing that could end this nightmare, but now they might as well have been miles away. Around them, the city held its breath. A small crowd had begun to gather at a safe distance, their hushed whispers carried on the cool evening breeze. Someone in the growing audience gasped as they saw the gun, and a few people pulled out their phones, their camera flashes adding to the surreal atmosphere. "Please, officer," Clark spoke softly, his years of courtroom experience helping him maintain his composure even with a gun pointed at him. "Think about what you're doing. Is this really necessary?" His words seemed to float in the space between them, heavy with meaning. The sergeant, who had been watching the scene unfold with growing horror, finally found his voice. "Davidson, lower your weapon. Now." The command came sharp and urgent, but Davidson's arm remained rigid, his finger too close to the trigger for comfort. He was reaching for something, Davidson insisted, his voice tight with tension. "I saw him." He was reaching for his identification, the sergeant cut in, taking a careful step forward. The identification that would have told you exactly who he is if you'd given him the chance to show it. The crowd had grown larger now. Cars were stopping completely instead of just slowing down, their headlights creating an impromptu spotlight on the unfolding drama. Someone in the back of the crowd recognized Clark and whispered his name, the words spreading through the onlookers like wildfire. Clark remained perfectly still, his hands now raised in plain sight. His mind raced through years of legal precedent, countless cases of police encounters gone wrong, and the bitter irony that he, the highest-ranking law enforcement official in the country, was now staring down the barrel of a police officer's gun. Sweat trickled down Davidson's forehead despite the cool evening air. His hands had begun to shake slightly, the reality of his situation finally starting to sink in. The weight of his mistake pressed down on him like a physical force, growing heavier with each passing second. "Son," Clark spoke again, his voice carrying the weight of authority without aggression, "whatever happens next is your choice. But think carefully about the path you're choosing right now." His words seemed to pierce through Davidson's armor of fear and bravado. The sergeant inched closer, his own hand hovering near his weapon but not drawing it. "Listen to him, Davidson. This isn't what you want your career to be remembered for. This isn't what you signed up for when you put on that badge." Time stretched like elastic, seconds feeling like hours. The crowd held their collective breath, phones recording every moment. In the distance, more sirens could be heard approaching. Someone had called for additional backup. Finally, something in Davidson's expression changed. It was subtle at first, a flicker of doubt, then understanding, then horror at his own actions. His arm began to lower, the gun's barrel pointing toward the ground instead of at the Attorney General of the United States. The tension in the air broke like a fever, replaced by a collective exhale from the gathered crowd. But even as Davidson holstered his weapon, everyone present knew this wasn't the end of the story, it was just the beginning of something much bigger. The flashing lights of approaching police cars painted the scene in alternating red and blue, a visual reminder that this incident would have repercussions far beyond this single street corner. As Clark straightened his tie and finally reached for his identification, he was already thinking about how this moment could become a catalyst for change. The night had started with a simple traffic stop, transformed into a potentially deadly confrontation, and was now poised to become something else entirely. A turning point in the ongoing conversation about power, justice, and accountability in law enforcement. The night air grew heavier with each passing moment as Officer Davidson, now visibly shaken but still clinging to his authority, ordered Clark to face his car. The Attorney General's expensive suit jacket brushed against the cold metal of his vehicle as he complied, dignity intact despite the humiliation unfolding around him. "Spread your legs wider," Davidson commanded, his voice carrying a slight tremor that betrayed his growing uncertainty. The crowd of onlookers had swelled, their murmurs growing louder as they recognized the man being treated like a common criminal. Someone in the crowd shouted, "That's the Attorney General," but Davidson pressed on, perhaps hoping that if he maintained control, this nightmare would somehow end differently. The pat-down was unnecessarily rough, Davidson's hands moving with exaggerated thoroughness as if to prove a point. Clark kept his composure, even as the officer's actions grew more aggressive. Each passing car slowed to a crawl, their headlights illuminating the scene like an impromptu stage, capturing every moment of this public spectacle. "Nothing to say now about being the Attorney General." Davidson's voice carried a forced bravado, trying to mask his growing realization that something was terribly wrong. The sergeant stood nearby, his face a mask of professional concern mixed with personal embarrassment for his junior officer's behavior. More police cars had arrived, their red and blue lights painting the street in alternating colors. The gathered crowd had pulled out their phones, recording every moment of this increasingly tense situation. The soft clicking of camera shutters mixed with the whispered conversations of the spectators. "Officer," Clark spoke calmly, his voice carrying the weight of decades in law enforcement, "you're putting on quite a show for our audience. Is this really how you want to represent your department?" His words were measured, chosen carefully to make Davidson think rather than react. The pat-down continued, but Davidson's movements became less certain. His hands trembled slightly as they moved across Clark's clothes, checking pockets that had already been checked, prolonging a moment that was quickly becoming infamous. A young reporter had pushed her way to the front of the crowd, notepad in hand, scribbling furiously. The story was writing itself: nation's top law enforcement official humiliated by local cop. Tomorrow's headlines were being born on this street corner. The sergeant finally stepped forward, his patience wearing thin. "Davidson, that's enough. We've established his identity." But Davidson wasn't quite ready to give up his last shred of perceived authority. "Just following procedure, sir," he muttered, though his voice had lost its earlier edge. The crowd's whispers had grown into a steady murmur of disapproval. Someone called out, "Power trip," and others nodded in agreement. Clark remained still, his mind already racing ahead to how this moment could be transformed into meaningful change. Every second of this humiliation was fuel for the reforms he'd been trying to push through, reforms that suddenly felt more urgent than ever. Finally, Davidson stepped back, his face flushed with a mix of emotions: embarrassment, fear, and the dawning realization of the magnitude of his mistake. The night that had started with a simple traffic stop had spiraled into a career-defining moment, and not in the way he'd hoped. As Clark turned around to face his tormentor, their eyes met briefly. In that moment, something passed between them, an understanding, perhaps, of how quickly power can corrupt and how easily authority can be misused. The Attorney General's expression held no anger, only a determined resolve that made Davidson look away first. The gathered crowd watched in tense silence as Clark straightened his tie and smoothed his jacket, restoring his dignity with simple, deliberate movements. The cameras continued to flash, capturing every moment of this scene that would soon be played and replayed on news stations across the country. What happened next would be talked about for years to come, not because of the humiliation, but because of how Clark chose to handle it. The night wasn't over yet, and the real test of character was just beginning. As more senior police officials arrived on the scene, the street corner had become more than just a location. It had become a turning point in the ongoing conversation about police reform and civil rights. The revelation hit the scene like a thunderbolt. "Sir," the surgeon's voice cracked with emotion as he addressed his superior officers who had just arrived, "this is Attorney General Clark." The words hung in the air, heavy with implications, as Davidson's face drained of all color. The police chief had arrived personally, stepping out of his vehicle with a mix of horror and disbelief written across his features. He'd been at home, enjoying a quiet dinner with his family when the call came in. Now, standing on this street corner, he was watching a potential career-ending disaster unfold before his eyes. Davidson stood frozen, his earlier bravado completely evaporated. The flashlight he'd wielded so confidently earlier now hung limply at his side, its beam pointing uselessly at the ground. His mouth opened and closed several times, but no words came out. What could he possibly say to make this situation better? The crowd had grown even larger, with local news vans pulling up to the scene. Camera crews rushed to set up their equipment, knowing they were witnessing something extraordinary. The bright lights from their cameras added to the surreal atmosphere, turning the quiet street corner into what felt like a movie set. Attorney General Clark, the police chief, stepped forward, his voice carrying both authority and genuine remorse. "I cannot begin to express our department's deepest apologies for this incident." He shot a withering glance at Davidson, who seemed to shrink under his superior's gaze. Clark adjusted his suit jacket one final time, his movements deliberate and calm. The crowd waited with bated breath, expecting anger, demands for immediate dismissal, perhaps even threats of legal action. Instead, what they witnessed would be remembered for years to come. "Chief," Clark's voice carried clearly through the night air, "what happened here tonight isn't just about me." He paused, looking around at the gathered faces, the angry crowd, the embarrassed officers, the shocked news crews. "This is about every citizen who's ever faced similar treatment without the protection of a title or position." The silence that followed was profound. Even the usual city noises seemed to have died down, as if the night itself was listening. Davidson's hands were visibly shaking now, his career flashing before his eyes. But Clark wasn't finished. "Officer Davidson," he turned to face the man who had just minutes ago held him at gunpoint, "I want you to think about something. Every person you stop, every citizen you interact with, they're someone's father, mother, son, or daughter. They deserve the same respect you'd want shown to your own family." The news cameras rolled, capturing every word. In the background, phones recorded and social media lit up with real-time updates. This wasn't just a local incident anymore, it was becoming a national moment. The police chief stepped forward again, ready to announce immediate disciplinary action, but Clark raised his hand. "Before we make any decisions tonight," he said, "I think we all need to step back and consider how to turn this incident into an opportunity for positive change." Davidson finally found his voice, though it came out barely above a whisper. "Sir, I don't know what to say." His face showed genuine remorse now, the reality of his actions finally sinking in completely. "Then don't say anything," Clark replied, his tone firm but not unkind. "Instead, think about what you're going to do differently tomorrow, and the day after that, and every day you put on that uniform." The gathered crowd had fallen completely silent, witnessing something they hadn't expected, not a display of power or revenge, but a lesson in leadership and grace under pressure. The night air seemed lighter somehow, despite the gravity of what had transpired. As more senior officials arrived and the paperwork began, everyone present knew they were witnessing more than just the resolution of a traffic stop gone wrong. They were seeing the beginning of what would become a watershed moment in police-community relations, all because of how one man chose to handle a moment of personal humiliation. The next morning, as sunlight streamed through the windows of the Justice Department, Clark sat at his desk reviewing the events of the previous night. His phone hadn't stopped ringing since dawn, reporters, politicians, and civil rights leaders all wanting to know how he planned to respond to the incident. On his desk lay the morning newspapers that headlined screaming in bold print about the confrontation. His secretary had already collected dozens of messages, each one demanding swift action against Officer Davidson. The easy path would be to call for the officer's immediate dismissal. It's what everyone expected, what many were demanding. Instead, Clark picked up his phone and made an unexpected call. "I'd like to schedule a press conference," he told his communications director. "But not here at the office. Let's hold it at the police academy." The suggestion was met with surprised silence on the other end of the line. Throughout the morning, word spread about the upcoming press conference. News vans began gathering at the police academy hours before the scheduled time. The crowd included not just reporters, but also civil rights activists, police officers, and ordinary citizens, all wondering what the Attorney General would say. As Clark stood at the podium, cameras flashing before him, he could see Officer Davidson standing at the back of the room, looking uncomfortable in his dress uniform. The young officer had been ordered to attend, probably expecting a public dressing down or worse. "Last night," Clark began, his voice steady and clear, "I experienced something that thousands of Americans face every day." He paused, letting the words sink in. "But I'm not here to talk about what happened to me. I'm here to talk about what happens next." The room fell silent, pens hovering over notepads, cameras zooming in on his face. "We could respond to last night's events with anger, with demands for punishment, with the kind of divisive actions that only deepen the rifts in our community. Or we could choose another path." He pulled out a folder from his briefcase, holding it up for all to see. "What I have here is a proposal, not for punishment, but for progress. A new training program that will be implemented across our police departments, focusing on community relations, de-escalation techniques, and cultural awareness." Murmurs spread through the crowd as Clark continued. Officer Davidson's actions last night weren't just about one man making a mistake. They were a symptom of a larger problem, a disconnect between law enforcement and the communities they serve. In the back of the room, Davidson's posture changed slightly, his shoulders straightening as he realized this wasn't going to be the public humiliation he'd expected. Clark made eye contact with him before continuing. "Starting next week, Officer Davidson will be working directly with my office, helping to develop these new training protocols. His experience, and yes, his mistake, will serve as a valuable lesson for future officers." The room erupted in surprised whispers. Reporters' hands shot up, questions flying from all directions. But Clark held up his hand for silence. "Some will say this response is too soft, that we're letting bad behavior go unpunished. But I ask you this, what serves our community better? Ending one officer's career or using this moment to help thousands of officers serve their communities better?" As he spoke, Clark could see faces in the crowd changing, from expectant anger to thoughtful consideration. Even some of the most vocal critics seemed to be pondering his words. "This isn't about forgetting what happened," he continued, his voice growing more passionate. "It's about remembering it in a way that creates lasting change. Every officer who goes through this new training program will learn from last night's incident, and hopefully they'll make better choices in similar situations." The press conference continued, but something had shifted in the room. What had started as an expectation of retribution had transformed into a discussion about reform and progress. As Clark fielded questions from reporters, he could see Davidson in the back, standing straighter now, a look of determination replacing his earlier shame. In the weeks that followed the incident, the Justice Department became a hub of unprecedented activity. Clark's office had transformed into a workshop of change, with experts from various fields coming together to reshape police training from the ground up. The atmosphere was charged with purpose and possibility. Officer Davidson sat at a conference table, surrounded by civil rights lawyers, veteran officers, and community leaders. His uniform was crisp as ever, but his demeanor had changed dramatically from the aggressive officer of that fateful night. He listened intently as people shared their experiences with law enforcement, each story adding another layer to his understanding. "I remember thinking I was always right," Davidson spoke up during one session, his voice carrying a new kind of humility. "The badge made me feel invincible." The room fell quiet, everyone listening to this rare moment of honest self-reflection from a police officer. Clark watched from the doorway, nodding slightly. The transformation he was witnessing wasn't just about one officer, it was about creating a ripple effect that would touch departments across the country. The incident that could have ended a career was instead sparking a revolution in police training. The new training program took shape day by day. It wasn't just about rules and procedures, it included real stories from both sides of the badge. Citizens came in to share their experiences, and officers opened up about their fears and challenges. The human element was always at the center. One afternoon, Clark received a surprising request. Davidson wanted to address the next class of police academy graduates. The Attorney General sat back in his chair, considering the proposal. It was risky, putting the officer who had pointed a gun at him in front of future officers. But sometimes the best lessons come from those who've made the biggest mistakes. The graduation ceremony was packed. Families of new officers filled the auditorium alongside veteran cops and community leaders. When Davidson stepped up to the podium, you could hear a pin drop. His hands shook slightly as he adjusted the microphone. "A few months ago, I thought I knew everything about being a police officer," he began, his voice steady despite his nerves. "I was wrong. Dead wrong." He paused, looking out at the sea of fresh faces. "I learned the hard way that this badge isn't about power, it's about responsibility." As Davidson shared his story, the audience sat spellbound. He didn't sugarcoat his actions or make excuses. Instead, he talked about the moment he realized he had become exactly the kind of officer he'd once sworn never to be. In the back of the room, Clark watched as the new officers leaned forward in their seats, absorbing every word. This was education you couldn't get from a textbook, raw, real, and powerful. The changes weren't just happening in classrooms. Out on the streets, officers who went through the new training program showed marked improvements in their interactions with the public. Complaints went down, while community trust began to climb. Local news stations started running stories about positive police interactions. Citizens reported feeling heard and respected during traffic stops. It wasn't perfect, change never is, but it was progress, real and measurable. One evening, as Clark was leaving his office, he spotted Davidson in the parking lot, heading home after another day of training sessions. The officer stopped and turned, meeting his gaze. No words were needed. Both men knew that something remarkable had grown from that terrible night. The incident that could have deepened the divide between police and community had instead become a bridge. It proved that sometimes the worst moments can lead to the best changes if people are willing to learn and grow from them. As the sun set over the city, casting long shadows across the Justice Department steps, both men knew they were part of something bigger than themselves. The night that started with a gun pointed at the Attorney General had sparked a movement that would change countless lives for the better. A year had passed since that fateful night, and Officer Davidson stood before a room full of senior police officials from across the country. The conference room at the National Law Enforcement Training Center buzzed with anticipation. What had started as a local reform program had caught national attention, and now departments everywhere wanted to learn from their experience. Davidson's hands no longer shook when he spoke in public. His voice carried the confidence of someone who had faced his worst moments and emerged stronger. "Before we begin today's training," he said, looking around the room, "I want you all to remember the night that changed everything." The lights dimmed and footage from that infamous traffic stop played on the screen behind him. Some of the officers in the room shifted uncomfortably in their seats, seeing themselves in Davidson's actions. Others shook their heads, wondering how things had escalated so quickly. "That man I was," Davidson continued as the video ended, full of pride and power, thinking the badge made me untouchable. He needed to be stopped. And he was, thanks to one man's choice to turn punishment into progress. The doors at the back of the room opened quietly, and Attorney General Clark slipped in. He stood silently at the back, watching as his former adversary had become one of the most effective advocates for police reform in the country. "Our program isn't just about avoiding mistakes," Davidson explained, clicking through slides showing dramatic improvements in community relations. "It's about understanding why we make them in the first place." The statistics told a powerful story. Complaints against officers who went through the new training program had dropped by 60%. Community satisfaction ratings had doubled, but the most striking changes couldn't be captured in numbers. A video montage played, showing officers across the city engaging with community members in new ways. There were clips of police officers playing basketball with local kids, attending neighborhood meetings, and handling tense situations with newfound patience and understanding. "This is what real protection and service looks like," Davidson said, his voice filled with quiet pride. "Not maintaining power over people, but working with them to build safer communities." Clark stepped forward then, joining Davidson at the podium. The room erupted in applause, many of the officers rising to their feet. These two men, once on opposite sides of a potentially tragic confrontation, now stood together as symbols of what positive change could look like. "What Officer Davidson and his colleagues have achieved here," Clark addressed the room, "goes beyond reform. They've created a new model for what policing can be in the 21st century." After the presentation, officers crowded around Davidson, eager to learn more about implementing similar programs in their own departments. The interest wasn't just professional, they could see the personal transformation in him, the way he carried himself with a different kind of confidence now. In a quiet moment between meetings, Clark and Davidson stood by the window, looking out over the city they had helped transform. "Did you ever imagine," Davidson asked, "that night would lead to all this?" Clark smiled, remembering the fear and tension of that moment. "Sometimes the worst situations give us the best opportunities to make real change," he replied. "But it only works if people are willing to learn and grow from them." The sun was setting over the city, casting a golden glow across the streets below. Somewhere out there, officers who had gone through their program were on patrol, approaching their duties with new understanding and awareness. Citizens were feeling safer, more respected, more heard. As they watched the city transition from day to night, both men knew their work was far from over. But they had proved something important, that even the darkest moments could lead to light if people were brave enough to choose a different path forward. 5 years had passed since that night when a traffic stop nearly ended in tragedy. The police academy's main auditorium was packed to capacity, with people standing along the walls and spilling out into the hallways. Today marked a special ceremony, the graduation of the 1000th class to complete the reformed training program. At the podium stood both Attorney General Clark and Officer Davidson, now promoted to Chief Training Officer. The sight of them together no longer surprised anyone, but their story still moved everyone who heard it. They had become living proof that transformation was possible, that one moment of crisis could spark lasting positive change. "When I look out at all of you today," Davidson addressed the crowd, his voice carrying the wisdom of someone who had learned life's hardest lessons in public, "I see the future of law enforcement. But more importantly, I see human beings who understand that the badge is a symbol of service, not power." The screens behind them showed footage from the past 5 years. Officers helping elderly residents across streets, playing basketball with neighborhood kids, mediating conflicts without force, and most importantly, treating every citizen with dignity and respect. What started as one terrible night, Clark added, stepping forward, has become a movement that's changing policing across our nation. He gestured to a group of police chiefs from other cities who had traveled to learn from their success. Our mistake wasn't falling down, it was thinking we couldn't build something better by getting back up. In the audience sat officers who had been through the program, alongside community members who had once distrusted the police. Together, they had built something remarkable, a model of community policing that actually worked. A young officer stood up to share her experience. Before this program, she said, I thought being tough meant being feared. Now I know that true strength comes from being respected, and respect has to be earned through understanding and compassion. The statistics backed up their success. Crime rates had dropped, not through aggressive policing, but through building trust. Community tip lines were busier than ever because people finally felt safe working with law enforcement. The us versus them mentality was slowly being replaced by a sense of shared purpose. Davidson pulled out an old photograph, a snapshot from that fateful night, captured by one of the bystanders. This picture used to shame me, he admitted, holding it up. Now it reminds me that our worst moments don't have to define us. They can inspire us to be better. Clark stepped forward again, placing a hand on Davidson's shoulder. 5 years ago, I could have demanded this man's badge, he told the audience. Instead, we demanded something more difficult, real change. And standing here today, I can say it was worth every challenging moment. The room erupted in applause as both men unveiled a new plaque for the Academy's entrance. It read, "Every encounter is an opportunity to build trust. Every mistake is a chance to learn. Every day is a new beginning." As the ceremony ended and people began to file out, a young recruit stopped Davidson. "Sir," she asked, "how do you handle the pressure of knowing your story is being taught in academies across the country?" Davidson smiled, looking over at Clark before answering. "I remember that it's not just my story," he replied. "It's the story of how one moment of humility and forgiveness can change countless lives. It's the story of how justice and compassion can work together to make our communities safer." The sun was setting outside, casting long shadows through the academy windows. Another class of officers would soon hit the streets, carrying with them not just badges and guns, but something more powerful, the understanding that true law enforcement isn't about control, but about connection. As Clark and Davidson walked out together, they knew their legacy would live on in every officer who chose understanding over force, communication over confrontation, and service over power. What had started as a potential tragedy had become a testament to the power of transformation, proving that sometimes the darkest moments can light the way to a brighter future.